Hello, bonjour, buenos dias, buenas tardes, wherever you are in the world. I'm very happy to be able to participate in this webinar. I'm Donna Mertens, and my specialization is in the area of evaluation, particularly with mixed methods evaluations and with focus on social justice. And so what I've been asked to speak with you about are qualitatively driven evaluations, and I added the mixed methods part because I think it's very important for evaluators, even if they're working from a qualitative perspective, to not lose sight of the potential to be including quantitative data in the qualitatively driven evaluations. This will be a somewhat different perspective than we heard from Ann Thibault, because it is couched in a different set of paradigms. If you're familiar with qualitative evaluation, you're probably familiar with the notion of the Constructivist Paradigm, which is a worldview that has been used as a basis for the conduct of much qualitative evaluation and research, by the way, but we will be discussing it in the context of evaluation today. And in terms of the Constructivist Paradigm, we look at the assumptions related to ethics or axiology, and what we're looking for is balanced representation. And we're looking for establishing relationships with good rapport with communities in which we conduct the evaluations so that they feel comfortable and safe in sharing information about their own experiences with us. This leads to the ontological assumption, or the nature of reality. And under the Constructivist Paradigm, we look at multiple socially constructed realities. So the suggestion is that there is not a single reality out there that we can go and measure and capture with a single number, but that there are different experiences about what is perceived to be real, and that we need interaction, that's the epistemological assumption, in order to understand what those versions of reality are, and to understand how they come to be constructed. And in order to collect data that would fulfill that purpose, then our methodological choices generally focus largely on qualitative approaches. But as I said earlier, we do include the use of quantitative data and sometimes even randomized controlled trials, as our previous speaker was mentioning, and we do that within the context of understanding the culture and context of the situation in which we conduct the evaluation. And so rather than having questions just as, did this program work? Or did this program work better than nothing? Or did this program work better than an alternative? We might use qualitative questions to frame the beginning of the evaluation by saying, how well do recruitment procedures work? In other words, are we actually reaching the populations that we intend to reach, and are there barriers that are preventing participation? So you can see the nature of these questions are quite different than just, does it work? Another qualitatively oriented question would be, how well does the intervention respond to the culture and context of the target population? So again, we're not making the assumption that this intervention, whatever it is or wherever it came from, is being responsive to culture and context, but we're actually proposing to collect data about how and to what extent it is responsive to culture and context. Or to what extent does the target population reflect the range of diversity with regard to overall goals of the project? And that question about diversity can be based on gender, could be based on race, ethnicity, on language, on economic status, on religious preference, on sexual orientation. Who is left out, and why is that segment of the population being left out? Another question, to what extent is ethics praxis built into the recruitment and evaluation process. So how are we operationalizing the concepts of respect when we are doing the recruitment and when we are conducting the evaluation process itself? How well does the target population understand what they are consenting to? And another corollary to that is, to what extent do participants accept the outcomes of randomization? Are participants willing to be randomized? And I think these are really important questions that we can ask as evaluators, because they give us insights into the appropriateness and resistance that we might encounter when we try to impose a randomized controlled trial design. In some contexts, those designs are very usable, but do we really understand how the participants are experiencing that and their acceptance of the conditions surrounding that? And so these are questions that we could ask from a qualitative point of view and put them into the context of a broader mixed methods, qualitatively driven design. And so this is a design that shows 4 stages in the evaluation, and it is a study that was cited by Charlene Hess-Spiber and conducted by Puschel and Thompson in 2011. And it was a study that was looking at why women did not use services for mammogram screenings and breast cancer screenings through mammograms, and that they had done a prior quantitative study showing that even though the mammogram screenings were free, that women were not taking advantage of this opportunity. And so they said, well, let's conduct a study where we come to understand what's important in the woman's perspective, in the woman's experiences. And so they began in stage 1 with a grounded theory study of women's experiences and barriers. And what they did was conduct focus groups. They did observations of women who were attempting to engage in the services, and they collected field notes. So you can see that they took the quantitative data available on uptake of services and followed that with grounded theory. They then went to a qualitative stage where they said, well, how can we use this information to modify the intervention so that it might become something that women would feel like they could participate in this, that they wanted, that they saw the value of it, they didn't see it as something that was a barrier for them. And from this, then, the interventions were put into the design of an RCT. So there was a randomized controlled trial, but it was done with the qualitatively driven grounded theory. There was a pre-measurement, quantitative measurement of the number of mammograms that had been taken up to that point. Then there was process evaluation that included observations of the interventions, interviews, and surveys. And then in stage 4, the use of post-tests, quantitative and qualitative, and behavior change. And so what you can see from this is that qualitative grounded theory informed everything that happened, and that there was also a strong component of qualitative within stage 3 in looking at the process. Okay, so that is gives you some hint about how a qualitatively driven study that's inclusive of quantitative approaches can lead us to ask different kinds of questions, can lead us to construct interventions that are different, to understand the processes that are going on throughout the intervention, and then to have a better understanding of how to be responsive to the needs and experiences of the constituencies that we work with. I want to also then bring in a second paradigm, the transformative paradigm, which is another one that can be qualitatively driven, but that can also use that can also use quantitative data in the mixed methods portion of the study. And here what we see is the transformative paradigm arose because people from marginalized communities expressed that even though qualitative work was being done, they weren't seeing themselves being accurately represented, or they weren't feeling that things were changing in order to bring about the social transformation that they would view as valuable. And so the transformative paradigm pushes on that concept of the respect for cultural norms and the support for human rights and social justice. So it asks evaluators to start by asking themselves this question: how can I design my study so that it does support human rights and social justice? And then it includes the question of reciprocity. What am I giving back to the communities from whom I collect data? And the answer to that, hopefully, if you design the study with a transformative spirit, is that you will give back an increase, a capability for people to have an increased respect for their rights and an increase in social justice in the communities in which they live. And so we look at reality a bit differently here, with a specific focus on the issues of power. There are many different versions of reality. They come from different social positionalities. Some of those positionalities are based within culture, economy, race, ethnicity, gender, age, religion, disability, and that our job as evaluators is to design studies that provide a critical interrogation of multiple realities, and trying to identify those versions of reality that sustain an oppressive status quo, and those versions of reality that allow us to move forward towards the human rights and social justice perspective. In order to do that, we must be aware of how we address issues of power, of how we form our interactive links with the communities, be cognizant of the social and historical location of knowledge, which means that we include the experience-based knowledge of members of the community, and with particular attention to diverse groups and people whose voices are not commonly included, and that we work towards the development of trusting relationships. And then our methodology begins with qualitative dialogic experiences in which we come to understand the context better, the stakeholders better, the cultural issues, who needs to be included, what it means to be respectful within that context, and then that we can add in quantitative mixed methods. And I put context there again because that is the part of evaluation that I think gets ignored at great peril. And so let me go on to the next slide, in which I share with you some questions that would be compatible with a transformative social justice orientation. And you can see from these questions that they're focused on gender, who will benefit and who will lose from this project in terms of gender, in the short term, in the long term. To what extent were women involved in the development of the program? Which organizations from government and civil society were included? How does the project challenge existing gender divisions in terms of labor, tasks, responsibilities, opportunities, and so forth? And what are the risks of backlash if changes are made? And so you see here, these questions are coming from a critical lens of looking at the extent, the type of involvement. If we're looking for social transformation, who are we included in the stakeholder groups, the government and civil society? If we do that, then we have a better chance of having sustainability with the interventions that we're evaluating. And so these are critical questions that are asked within a transformative evaluation. Not everyone. These are sample questions. Okay, and so we can look about the main principles for transformative mixed methods evaluation is the recognition of power relations, the identification of structural causes of inequality and discrimination, because we can't address inequality and discrimination without looking at structural causes, determining the impacts of programs on impoverished people and groups who face discrimination. And so we want to give specific focus to these groups within the communities in which we work, involve participatory and reflective processes, and acknowledge human rights and equality and determine the claims of rights holders, the people we're working with in the study, and the obligations of duty bearers, so the funding agencies and so forth, the service providers. We want to aim for the progressive realization of human rights and gender equality. So if we look at contextual factors, we're looking at things like this: the history of the nation, the country, the locale, the political context, the government, legislation, and corruption, the organizations in the community, the NGOs, universities, agencies, cultural inclusion and exclusion. What is the basis for that in the context in which you're working? What are the power structures? How did they reflect discrimination and oppression? And the idea of community resilience. So I wanted to use this slide to just talk about the importance of context, because in international development in particular, we often think, okay, the solution to poverty for women is to make sure they get an education and to make sure that they have a way of making some money. And that is what I want to say, is that that is not a bad idea, but it has to be critically considered within the context. And so we see here in Kyrgyzstan that women do obtain more education, but they do obtain lower paying occupations. So they usually are making 2.5 times less than traditional male occupations. So what happens with men? The men are unemployed. They don't have the degree of education, and that they now are suffering through the stereotype of the view that men should be the breadwinners. And the consequence of that is the higher suicide rate, 4 times more likely among men than women, a lower life expectancy, and the fact that the men are feeling this threat to their identity as males, that there's more conflict in the family and society, a lack of tolerance for difference, and a greater willingness to use brute force. Does that mean then that we don't educate women or don't make sure they have jobs? No, but we have to be cognizant of what the backlash can be, and how do we then introduce an intervention that provides culturally appropriate ways to shift that stereotype that is sustaining an oppressive status quo. And so sometimes the solutions are more cultural than they are economic. And so in context, we can look at the issues I've brought up about context. We can look at the capacity within organizations and how we can build them. We can look at the needs and assets that are available in the community, and we can look at the relevance of the current services and structures and see how those can be modified. Very important in social justice transformative evaluation is the use of teams to identify existing community action groups and understand the history of their efforts, identifying existing formal and informal and potential leaders, because we know that change comes through champions, identifying community needs and gaps, but also community strengths and opportunities, and understanding that target population so that you can improve, build, and secure project credibility within the community, and to create momentum for project activities by getting community input. So you can see here the focus is not just on did a program work, but how do we come to understand the context and the experience around that program so that we can be more responsive? And in doing that, we need to be prepared to challenge theories of change, to introduce discussion about how we incorporate diversity into who has the power to define the theory of change, and what the power differentials are, by using that on-the-ground experience of intended staff and participants, and by using social and psychological theories about behavior change. I want to give you one final example of an HIV/AIDS prevention project in Botswana that illustrates the use of this qualitatively driven, transformative, indigenous, mixed methods use of evaluation. And in this context, the University of Botswana was given a grant in order to develop a program for preventing HIV/AIDS transmission in Botswana for young people, and they had a partner with a United States university. And so what you see here is how the design of the study was qualitatively driven, but also inclusive of a randomized controlled trial. In the first stage, the people in Botswana assembled a team, and the team was very diverse. It included people from the university, from health clinics, schools, parents, churches, and community groups. And they read through documents, they engaged in dialogue, so that they felt that they could identify appropriate contextual factors that they needed to collect more data on. And in the second stage, then, they collected qualitative data through training youth to go out into the communities and to talk with youth about the meaning of HIV/AIDS in their lives. And the youth said, first of all, they don't use that terminology. They call it the sickness. They don't talk about it directly. They talk about it indirectly through songs and poetry and parables and metaphors. And so this became something that the team was able to analyze and say, okay, what is the meaning? What is the meaning of this sickness in this community? And the overwhelming finding from that particular part of the qualitative study was that the youth experienced a sense of sadness, that people they knew were dying or had died, that parents, aunts, uncles, cousins, friends, teachers, everyone had losses in their family, and so they felt a real sense of sadness. And the other thing that they said was that they didn't see that they had much of a future because they see people dying. And so they say, well, if we're only going to be here for a little while, we might as well have sex because it's pleasurable, and we're probably going to die anyway. And at the same time they were doing that part of the study, they were collecting quantitative demographic information through surveys of the students' knowledge of how to prevent transmission, of the incidence data, and disaggregating that data by a variety of characteristics. In stage 3, there was a pilot intervention put together that, well, let me say this. In between stage 2 and 3, there was an advisory board meeting, and the people from the United States came and said that they thought that the solution would be to provide students with information about how to prevent the spread of the disease by talking about abstinence and the use of condoms. And the people from Botswana were able to say, look, from our preliminary analysis in stage 2, we know that the majority of these students already know this, but the problem is really framed in sadness and lack of a perceived future. And so we need to change the intervention from knowledge to one that works at that level of feelings and emotions and planning for a future by coming to a realization that the choices you make will determine your future. And so they did this as a very qualitatively based pilot, excuse me, with observations and interviews and surveys throughout. They modified it. They tried this a number of times until they had an intervention that they felt was appropriate. And so you see the bottom part with pre-test knowledge, attitudes, behaviors. That was the beginning of a randomized controlled trial. And then throughout the process of the implementation, there was a process evaluation, and then there were post-tests, quantitative, qualitative data was collected about behavior change. There was also attention to the use of the information in terms of policy change, and there were requests from other countries to borrow the ideas that they had used. And so the people from Botswana said, well, you can't do it exactly the way we did it, because the reason it works for us is because we were so intent on understanding our context. And so we'll share with you the process we used, but you will need to go through that process in your own contexts. Okay, so we see there how the use of information was to emphasize human rights and social justice, to analyze the asymmetric power relations. So the U.S. university saying, we know what the solution should be, and the Botswana University saying, just a minute, because we have data that supports a different kind of intervention would seem to be more appropriate. The advocacy for culturally competent relations between the evaluators and the community members. Remember, the team trained youth so that they could go into the communities and talk with other youth. They employed culturally appropriate mixed method studies. So the social action, the culturally appropriate mixed methods meant that the use of a standardized survey wasn't appropriate to find out the experience, how HIV/AIDS was experienced, that needed to be done indirectly through songs and art and poetry and so forth. And then the application of appropriate critical theories, whether it's feminist, critical race, post-colonial, indigenous theories. Okay, and then making sure that throughout the process, the information is being used so that you don't wait for the final report in order to say, the intervention wasn't working. And so you include that utilization by asking participants to be active participants, maybe in the data gathering themselves, in the interpretation, and that we include in our designs the policy analysis and advocacy avenues that are necessary for social change. Okay, so in conclusion, this approach takes courage. It takes knowledge of quantitative and qualitative because of the need to capture complexity, address social justice, and act in an ethical manner. The use of teams is highly recommended, and the capacity development is a critical aspect. Okay, so that finishes my presentation, and I will ask the moderator if we have time for questions.
Thank you, Donna, very much. Can you all hear me? Great, thank you. So fortunately, we do have time for a few questions. We're only going to do two. The first question is from Fasila Hussein. She's asking if and how qualitative methods help understand complexity. And then we have another question, how do contextual factors can help explain some of the findings obtained at the end of the evaluation process? A third question, with the recognition of power relations, what is your advice for design, monitoring, and evaluation practitioners that want to apply transformative evaluation models in the context of neoliberal developmental industrial complex? Concepts like resilience, local capacities, and the everyday are often co-opted by international duty bearers and service providers that have programs that undermine transformative values in local contexts. I'm going to post these questions again in the chat box so you can have a look at them. I'm going to give the floor back to you to discuss this.
Hey, I'll do my best to try to remember all the ones that you raised. Okay, so the first one deals with the use of qualitative data and the study of complexity. And I think that this is one of the strongest arguments for either a dominantly qualitative study or the inclusion of qualitative data within a mixed methods study, because if we really listen to people about their experiences and why they're either able to access or not access or choose not to access services, we can understand the complexity of what's going on. One of my past students was doing a study on HIV/AIDS in South Africa, and she was deaf herself, and she asked why deaf people didn't come in to get the services, and the people who were providing the services just said, well, they can come if they want to. Well, that's sort of like the old saying about, women can do anything they want to, except that they're not being supported in ways that make it safe or comfortable, or really able to have accurate communication. And so the use of qualitative data in that case allowed the inclusion of the voices of the people who are deaf, saying that no interpreters were being provided, and that when they did come, they felt that they were being disrespected and treated like they were stupid people, when in fact they simply couldn't hear. And so being able to tease out who's not being served or who's receiving services that are not viewed as being respectful or appropriate, for me, the qualitative data helps us reveal that complexity. Okay, the second question, let's see, I'm trying to find the second question. Has to do with, the qualitative data as being something to help enlighten the findings at the end of the evaluation process. Absolutely, that is another excellent argument for the inclusion of contextual factors and qualitative data. Although we wouldn't want to limit it only to the end of the evaluation process, we would want to include it throughout, as I showed in those cyclical multi-phase designs that I shared with you, that the contextual information, yes, can be used as a help to understand and interpret findings, but that should not be the only place where the contextual data comes into play. Now, the third question had to do with power relations. Let's see, I think. Okay, what is the recognition of power relations? Uh-oh, it keeps moving. Okay, I think what we need to start with is the use of principles for good evaluations, and I know that the American Evaluation Association has them, Australian Evaluation has them, the Latin American group just came out with their principles, the African Evaluation Association has them, and that in those principles we find the need for inclusion of stakeholders in appropriate and respectful ways, and that if we're going to conduct a good evaluation, that we need to build in the mechanisms for that. And so I start with the notion that, we want to do a very good evaluation. And, I've yet to have a client say, no, we just want a mediocre evaluation. But if you say you want a good one, well, then let's look at what the standards are that define a good evaluation. And one of those is that appropriate inclusion and respectful inclusion, and building in the use of information, because that's one of the primary criteria for a good evaluation. And so by doing it in that way, it's not saying that the voices of the powerful are not important. They certainly are. They are a representative group of the stakeholders, but they don't represent all the voices. And so by making an argument that by inclusion of more voices, it improves the quality of the evaluation, and if it can be done in a way that brings those voices in before the intervention is finalized, then we can say that the intervention itself has a higher potential for being responsive to the needs in that community. Just like with the Botswanan example, that if a knowledge-based curriculum had been used, it would have been another waste of time and money, because that wasn't the nature of the problem. The problem was sadness and lack of a future. And so trying to make those arguments on very pragmatic terms, and also on standards for good evaluation and on values. And then by having the use of advisory boards, and sometimes you might have to have more than one advisory board. You might have a professionals advisory board, you might have a methodology advisory board, you might have a community-based advisory board, and depending on the fractiousness of the community, you might have to have several of those community-based advisory boards. And so we try to do that by the collection of evidence that is viewed as credible from the different perspectives. If the Botswanans had just said to NIH and to the U.S. University, look, we don't think that's going to work for us, without data that they had collected during that phase 2, it would not have been as powerful. And so that, I think, is how we use the resources that we have as evaluators, and also how we structure for inclusion and for respect. I turn it over to our moderator.